Hello, everybody, and welcome back. We're going to get started with our last presentation, last but definitely not least. I want to introduce Dr. Hedda Median, who's a professor and the head of the Department of Special Education at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. She's a Gold Stick Family Scholar and a board-certified behavior analyst. Her research focuses on social communication skills and challenging behavior of children with autism and other developmental disabilities and intervention methods to enhance these spheres of functioning. Today, she's going to talk to us about using telepractice to build capacity within families and communities. So without further ado, I'm going to let you talk, Ms. Heather.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm excited to be here, excited to present to you. I hope this will be a more interactive session. So I know this has been a long day for all of you. You've been sitting for the same place in front of your screen for a long time. So please use the chat, question and answer. I'll try to and I know Shannon will help me throughout the session to respond to different questions, answer different questions. So it will be more discussion and less lecture. So today I'm going to talk about, these are the agenda for today. I'm going to talk about why we're doing what we're doing, talk a little bit about telepractice, because I feel like so many of us became experts in telepractice and the use of internet technology. The importance of working in the natural environment. Most of our work is with young kids with autism in the natural environment, in the home or school or playground. The importance of adult learning theory and why I'm going to talk about that. And then I'm going to talk about a series of studies that we've done, my research team and I working on, and kind of thinking about how we move from one study to another and what we learn from each one of the study. And of course, we'll kind of end with how these all build capacity within families, within communities. And we'll have some time at the end for some questions and answers. So making the case, why are we even doing all of that? So natural environment, we know this is where kids spend most of the time. We know that this is when we teach something to children in natural environment, they learn and be able to generalize. If we're using more clinic settings, sometimes generalization is something that's hard for them to do. And natural change agents is something else we emphasize. Natural change agents are the people that are communicating or interacting with the kids on every day. These are the real people in the natural environment, like parents, like teacher, like therapist. It's not including us as researcher. So when we use natural change agent and we use natural environment, then the learning enhance and generalization and maintenance sustainability. Evidence-based intervention is, of course, something we all follow and try to use because this is something we have evidence that's working. Caregiver implementing intervention, many of you might have heard about parent implemented intervention. We kind of broaden that and start calling that caregiver implemented intervention because we know family structure change and it's not just a father and a mother, and father and mother are not always the one who are taking care of the child. Sometimes it's a grandparent, it's an uncle, it's an aunt. So it's caregiver implemented intervention, and that's the focus of all of our intervention. So we don't work directly with the kids, we work with other adults who work with kids directly and train them to work with them. We know from the literature, from working with professionals and caregivers that caregivers and professionals need support. They need access to evidence-based practices. They need some coaching of how to use those and implement them. And finally, we know, and we knew it, I mean, we worked with telepractice for more than 10 years, but now that we all been kind of using Zoom, for example, even for today, we know that professional development activity via telepractice are effective. So these are kind of the foundation, and now I'm going to talk about different principles that kind of guide our work. So just a little bit about telepractice. Again, I think we all kind of learn to love and sometimes hate the use of technology in our work. But we have some benefits for telepractice. We know it reduces time for travel and costs for traveling, especially now with the gas prices. So kind of doing everything from home for your own station, it could reduce travel time and cost. Less intrusive, this is something many parents tell us, or caregivers tell us, that they prefer that someone will not come into the home, but just have see one part of their home. And I am a mother of 4 boys, so I can completely understand that, why sometimes it's easier for me to clean one part of the house and not all of it. So it's parents or caregiver feel it's less intrusive when we're using telepractice. When the service provider or the therapist is not there, it's encouraging caregiver active participation. So parents are there with the child and working with them. It's also more flexible. So it's canceling is much easier. Changing things are much easier. And of course, it's allow us to cover a larger geographical area for professional. With all these benefits, we always need to remember there's some barriers to telepractice. And the biggest one are the access to internet, access to technology, access to knowledge. So every time we use telepractice, we really need to think about what are the barriers? And we know we have many benefits, or what are the barriers that we need to consider when we decide to use telepractice? A little bit about the technology that we're using. We've been using Zoom for a long time. I'm not going to talk about Zoom because everyone knows what it is. We have website with different information, and we use technology not just to communicate with the adult that we're working with, it's parents, professional. It's also the way we're doing research. So we collect all the data through Google form, everything is online, and of course, HIPAA and FERPA compliance website. So everything is collected and saved there. So we use the technology both to provide the services, but also to conduct our research. So the principle that guides early intervention, most of the kids we're working on are early intervention, 0 to 3, but we also work with a little bit older kids. And kind of going back to what I said at the beginning is the importance of using the natural environment. So the Office of Special Education, U.S. Department of Education, developed principles for why we need to use natural environment, why it's so important. The first one is familiar people and familiar context. We know kids feel most comfortable in the natural environment with their own toys, with their own people that are around them. So this is something that really support, again, generalization, helping kids learn where they feel more comfortable. We know that all family can enhance their children's development if they get the correct or the appropriate support. So we can support every family to support in the natural environment their kids' development. But we need to remember that family members are not the therapists, are not the professionals. We are the professional and we are the therapists. So our role is really to support family member to use different strategy in the natural environment. And one of the rationale for using that is if we give parents or caregiver the tools to use with their kids, the kids will have many more opportunity to practice new skills, learn new things, because it's throughout the day embedded in the natural routine that they have. So that's why it's important for us to support family members. But I think, I'm sure many of you heard about it, that family said, we don't want to be the therapist. We want to be the parent of the child. So we need to support parents to use strategy, but remember our role there. We also need to remember that each family is different. So we really need to individualize and really think about the cultural belief and practices that each family have. These cultural belief and practices might be different than our own cultural belief and practices. So we really need to learn to understand where the family comes from, what's the cultural belief, and individualize the way we work with them in their own natural environment. And of course, we need to listen to parents. Caregiver and parents are the expert on their kids. And you probably will hear that from me a few times. They are the expert. They know best what's good for the family, what's good for the kid. We really need to listen to them and think about what priorities they have for their family and for their kids. And that goes to the sixth one, which the primary provider's role and what the role, and this is specifically for EI, and how the EI coordinator kind of need to coordinate and make sure that parents have access to all they need. And finally is, as I mentioned before, evidence-based practices. The practices that we use, the principles that you need to be validated by research, need to be related to the law and regulation. So these are kind of the guiding principle for natural environment. I saw there was a question, but it disappeared. So I assume Shannon is looking at those. Another thing that I want to mention is, in addition to the Office of Special Education within the U.S. Department of Education, DEC, the Division of for Early Childhood within the Council for Exceptional Children, developed recommended practices for working with young children with disabilities or at risk for disabilities. These are guidance for most effective ways to improve learning, promote development of young children, and they are supported by research, values, and experience. So it's not just research, also thinking about what stakeholders think about it, if they're acceptable or not. And they develop different themes across different practices, and I'm just going to talk about the one related to families. So the DEC family practices include three primary practices. The first one, and I'm sure everyone know about these, are the family-centered practices. These are practices that treat families with dignity and respect and involve family member in acting on choices to strengthen child, parents, and family functioning. So the unit is not just the child. When we think about an intervention, we need to think about the child within the family. So really thinking about the family as the center and respecting and involving family as much as possible. So this is something that guides every work that we do in early childhood, early intervention, early childhood, but we know that it's good for every child, in every age. So it's something that's emphasized in early childhood, but of course it's kind of continuous throughout the child's life. The second practice is family capacity building practices, and it is related directly to the topic of today's presentation. And the idea is that every family has strength, and they have knowledge and skill. And our role is really to strengthen those knowledge and skills and help the family build capacity in addition to what they have. Again, families are expert. They have knowledge, they have skill, and we just need to build on those. We need to identify those and enhance those. So these are the family capacity building practices. And the last one is, of course, family and professional collaboration. I ask who's attending this meeting, because I missed the first few sessions, and I heard there's a lot of professionals attending today. So I'm sure everyone is aware of that, the importance of building relationship with families, between families and professional, and relationship is kind of the foundation for developing positive and outcomes for the families and the child. So again, we talked about the principle for natural environment, principle of working with families. And I want to talk a little bit about adult learning theory. And why do I talk about adult learning theory? Is because most of our work is not directly with kids, not directly with children with autism and other developmental disability. Most of our work is directly with adult. It could be a caregiver, it could be a parent, it could be a grandma, or it could be a BCBA or early intervention providers. So we really need to think about what we need to do in order to help other adults learn new skills and new knowledge. And this is where the adult learning theory come. And they are 7 principles or characteristics of adult learning theory that we really try to embed within each one of the program that we develop. And again, I'm sure this is kind of knowledge to everyone. So first thing is introduction, the importance of introducing information to people. Then we need to illustrate to the learning and making sure that the learner have an opportunity to practice what they learn, if it's knowledge, if it's practice, if it's strategy, it's a skill. Then we need to have the learner evaluate their own performance and reflect. Reflection is something that when we did the study and we look at how about each one of these characteristics, many times people kind of forget about the reflection. But reflection is so important because this is where we look at our own behavior and think about what we did wrong or what we did do great and what we might want to change. And finally is mastery. So these are the 7. So mastery is when the learner kind of evaluate and self-assess and see what was learned and how they are doing. So these are adult learning theory. And again, we try to embed them in each one of the project that we're working. And why are these so important? So I think this graph really illustrates why these things are so important. So when we think about something that we teach, if we just read about it or just hear about it or just see it, the learning, if you look after 2 weeks, if you check again after 2 weeks, how much learning was retained, it's not very high. When we combine listening and hearing and looking or watching something, we see increase. But only when we talk it out or reflecting, and when we walk it, which when we really practicing, then we see, excuse me, increase. So this kind of graph really kind of demonstrates the importance of each one of the characteristics of adult learning theory. And I like this quote: I see and I forget, I hear and I remember, I do and I understand. So only when we really do and have the knowledge, then we can retain the information, understand what we're doing. So this is the importance of not just listening to a presentation, but also going and really practicing and getting and reflecting on that and receiving feedback. And when I'm talking a lot about coaching. Most of the studies that we have or the programs that we develop have 2 components. The first component is training, and most of the training are done through online modules, self-paced, so people can go online and learn about some kind of skills or activity. I'll talk in a second what we focus on. And that's the first part of the learning. The second part of the learning is really the coaching. The coaching is where we really do the practice, the reflection, the feedback, which are so important. Research shows us that training by itself is not enough. If we go back to what we just talked about in adult learning theory, learning by itself needs to have practice in addition to the training. So the combination of training and coaching usually leads to the best outcomes for adult. So I also mentioned that coaching is really based on relationship. So successful relationship. And when we think about element of successful relationship, trust and respect, and of course it needs to be from professional to families or whoever the adults who are working together, communication, excuse me. So open communication, sometimes when we work with families, I think it's important for us to think about what's the best or the preferred way to communicate with them. Some will say email, but some will not use email. So they might want text, they might want notes. So we really need to think about what's the best way to communicate. Professional attitude is something that we need to think about as professional and what our attitude that we bring to our job. Willingness to change, we all need to change. We all learn a lot in the past 2 years and how, things in the environment made us change and made us adjust and be flexible. And the last thing is cultural reciprocity. And I think this is very important because in the past, when we went to families' home and we worked with family, we were told, leave all your cultural belief and practices and everything before you enter the home, beyond the door. And we know it's not possible. We cannot leave the practices, our beliefs beyond the door, really bring everything with us inside the home, inside the family context. So there needs to be some cultural reciprocity, which requires some learning for us to learn about our own practices and belief and priorities and what we think needs to be important or not important, and for us to understand what the families are, cultural beliefs, practices, priorities. So there's reciprocity here, and it's not just we put everything we know and believe in back and just listen to the parents. It needs to be some reciprocity of us learning about ourselves and learning about the family and kind of thinking about how all of that will work. So coaching, there are different model of coaching, and you might have use different type of coaching model. You might heard about or read about. We're using the Sheldon and Rush coaching model, but I have to say that most of the coaching models have the same, very similar component. So for Sheldon and Rush, joint planning is when the coach and the learner meet together and decide what's the goals, what we're looking for, what the context, what are the plan for the session, what strategy we're going to work on. Then observation, so observing what's going on, action and practice. So the learner use the practices they learn with the child or with another adult, whoever. I'll talk about that in a second. Reflection. As I mentioned, this is something that's important for us not to forget, and make sure to remind the parents we're working with or the professional we're working with, if we have BCBA who coach RBTs, for example. So help them reflect and think about what they've done, how they're doing it, what they might want to change for next time. And finally, the feedback. And feedback should include both supportive feedback and constructive feedback. So what we're doing well and what need to be changed. This is something that we, and I'll show you in a second, the checklist that we're using, but this is something that guides our work. Kind of to put everything together, when we think about partnering with family, we talk about natural environment, we talk about natural change agent, we talk about cultural reciprocity, partnership. Two more things that to kind of consider is empowerment. And I know sometimes I use this word empowerment, and some caregiver tells us, well, we're already empowered. And we just said that, right? Parents are the expert on their kids, or caregiver are the expert on the kids. The idea in empowerment is help the caregiver build their capacity and strengthen their skills, their knowledge, and the confidence. Sometimes it's the confidence piece that helps them feel empowered. And lastly is advocacy. So really help family identify the needs of their family and their kids, and learn how to advocate for those. So when we think about family and think about child outcomes and family quality of life, these are the main characteristics that we need to think, consider in every work that we're doing with them. So next I'm going to talk about different, I mentioned that I'm going to describe different research projects that we've done. And we are doing, we're using the term cascading model. There's some other people use the same idea and call it train the trainer. But I'll talk about cascading model and how we're kind of using different type of cascading model to make sure that the natural change agent are the people who work with the kids. Again, natural change agent who work with the children in their natural environment, provide more opportunity for the kids to learn new things and also to practice them throughout the day, embedded in natural routine. So this is something that we emphasize. So we as researcher, I'm at the University of Illinois, we can work directly with caregivers who work directly with their child. So we train and coach caregiver how to use evidence-based practices, and the caregiver use this strategy in their own environment with their child to help the child develop. Most of our work is focusing on social communication behavior. As I'll discuss in a few minutes, most of the kids we're working with are minimally verbal, which means they have very limited verbal communication. So we're focusing on a few specific strategy. We talk about environmental arrangement, how we can arrange the physical environment and the social environment to make sure the kids have opportunity to request or to comment and receive some feedback. So this is environmental arrangement. Modeling is when we model something and the child needs to imitate us. Man model is providing a choice, asking a question, or giving an instruction. And time delay, where we have a regular routine in which the child and the caregiver usually engage, and helping the caregiver to stop at some moment where the child know what to expect, and then they can request or comment or something. So these are the main strategy that we're using. Most of the kids, as I mentioned, are very young, have autism, and are minimally verbal. So this kind of cascading model is what we call typical parent caregiver implemented intervention. So again, researcher, train and coach caregiver who train and coach child. But there's another one we can kind of think about. We can think about researcher who train and coach professional like BCBA, developmental therapist, OT, PT, who then work directly with the child, with the caregiver who work directly with the child. And the last one is there are some communities or countries where we have very limited number of professionals. We call them low resource setting or communities. And in these communities, we don't have enough professional to work with caregivers. Again, we think that it's better not that the researcher will not be the one who work with the child or the caregiver. So in this situation, sometimes we work, and I'll show you an example of that, of how we collaborate with other caregivers who have more experience to coach and train other caregivers to work directly with their kids. So this is again the cascading, and of course we have the final one that could be researcher, professional, caregiver, and child. So these are the different tiers within the cascading model, and we can have different type of intervention. And now I'm going to show you different studies. I'm going to share with you some data and graphs. I hope you all be excited as I am about different graphs, but I'll try to walk through and explain the graphs and what they mean. So the first study is, as I mentioned before, it's kind of a typical researcher caregiver child, parent or caregiver implemented intervention. So again, the researcher train and coach the caregiver who then work directly with their child. The first study that I'm going to show, and again, I'm just going to show a few studies. Of course, we have many more. So the purpose of this study and these are, of course, we're using behavioral principles, and our studies, the one I present today will be single case research, and I'll kind of go through those too. Is there a functional relation between training and coaching caregivers via telepractice and an increase in the use of communication strategy with high fidelity? So kind of breaking this research question a little bit into different components. So we have the intervention, which is the training and coaching the caregivers. And we have the dependent variable. What we measure is to see if the parents use the strategy that I mentioned before, environmental arrangement, modeling, man model, and time delay with high fidelity, which means they use it with the steps that we teach them to use it, how accurate they use the strategy. So we want to see if the intervention help the parents use this strategy with high fidelity, with high accuracy. The second question is about social validity. And this is something that's very important, I think, for all of us to consider. We can develop an intervention that will be effective and will see great outcomes, but the caregiver will tell us, you know what, it's too much work. I'm not going to use it as soon as you've done this study. So it's not feasible or not acceptable. So then it's not social valid. I mean, we can be great researcher, but if the parents or the caregiver or the professional will not continue to use this strategy, it does not much sense to continue with that. So social validity is something very important for us. We want to make sure that the goals or priority of the intervention are important. We want to make sure that the methods or the procedure we're using are acceptable and feasible for the people who needs to implement them. And we want to make sure that the outcomes are important. So if a child changed something very small and it doesn't have a lot of changes in the quality of life of the child and the family, maybe we shouldn't put so much effort in that specific intervention and think about the different intervention that we can use. For this study, we had 3 children with autism, 2 boys, 1 girl, all from Illinois, minimally verbal, so less than 10 functional words. We have 3 mothers, and this is something you'll see across the studies I'll present today. All the caregivers were mothers, even though we have a few studies with fathers, but this is something we still need to work on because we need to think about the diversity of the population we're working with and make sure it's representative of all families that we work with. The design was single case research, and it was multiple baseline across strategies. So now I'm going to show you the graph, and I want to go through the graph to make sure that we all know there's a lot going on here. So on the left side, which will be the line graph, we have the percentage of quality strategy. This is the fidelity. So the line graph will be the quality or the fidelity in which the parents use the strategy. On the right side, we have the bar graph, which is the average use per minute, so the rate of strategy use. The first three tiers, tier one is about modeling, how the parents use the modeling. Tier two is man model, how the parents use man model strategy, and time delay is the last one. The final tier, the lowest one, is the child's behavior. On the left side, we have the percentage of responses to the parents' use of strategy. And on the right side, we have the number of initiation. So if we look at baseline, just for example, we see the rate, which is the bar graph. And just for the purpose of this presentation, we've combined it across all session within each phase. We see that the bar graphs are kind of low, so the parents don't use this strategy very often. And we see that when they use it, they don't use it with high fidelity. So they don't use the steps that we know that the evidence base for this specific strategy. So then we do training, online training. They just learn about the strategy. There's no coaching. And we see some changes. We see, for example, for modeling, we see a lot of variability in the fidelity, how well they use the strategy. We see some small changes in rate. For man model, we see increasing rate, but a lot of variability in how well they use the strategy. Time delay is the strategy that we use probably least often. And we see that the parents do not use that with a lot of strategy. And again, this graph represents one family. We have 12 graphs. I'm just showing you one of the graphs because we had 12. I presented 3, but we had 12 different single case. So each family is their own control. So we compared the mom use of the strategy before the intervention and after the intervention. But the coaching phase of the intervention is introduced to the mom about each one of the strategy at a different time. So next, we're going to introduce coaching related to modeling. When we see the mom is using modeling with high fidelity, we'll move to do coaching on man model. When we see changes, we will move to modeling to coaching on time delay. So this is what happened with coaching with modeling. We see increase in rate and we see gradual increase in the quality of the strategy used, the fidelity. When we move to coaching on man model, again, increase in rate, increase in the fidelity. Same thing we do when we look at time delay. So overall, we see that as soon as we start coaching, and it's going back to the adult learning theory we just talked about, training by itself is not enough. We see some changes in training, but only when we start the coaching, we see a jump in the fidelity or the accuracy of the use of the strategy, and we also see some changes in the rate. So the blue line showing you when the coaching done, we see increase in fidelity. After we stop with the coaching, we see some decrease, but what's important is that the parents continue to use the strategy when they use it in the natural environment with high quality. Then we'll look at the kids' data, and we see a lot of variability. Look at that for a second. There's not a lot of changes that we can look at the intervention and the data. The only thing you might want to see is that when the parents is coached on time delay, we see some increase in the number of initiation. And that's not very surprising because when parents are kind of coached on time delay, the parents are learn how to stop and not say anything and wait for the child to initiate. So the kids have more opportunity to initiate. So we'll see some changes here. But what's interesting that although we saw changes in parents' behavior, we don't see clear changes in kids' behavior. But when we ask the parents and other family member, what do they think about the intervention? They all said, oh my gosh, this changed our life. This is something that we feel so much difference pre and post intervention. We see the children behaving differently. They use more strategy. And we're looking at the data and we say, we don't see that. So this is where we as researchers are going saying, okay, maybe the data that we collected not reflecting what we see. And then we had a group of doctoral students who decided to go and investigate it a little bit more in a more sensitive way. So they went back and analyzed all the data again, which takes an hour and hours, as you probably all know. And this is representing for each phase. So we see that in baseline, that this specific child used mostly fully physical assistant. So prompting, physical prompting, and some gesture. Across the time, when we move from one phase to another, we see some changes. And then when we get to the time delay, the last coaching phase, we see the child with less full physical prompt, much more vocalization, and some independent sign context. So they are correct independent sign. So we do see some changes in child behavior. We just need to be a little bit more sensitive in the way we measure that. So, of course, social validity, as I mentioned, is something that's very important for us. When we interview caregiver, the one who implemented the intervention, we interview people who other family member, and everyone were very happy with the intervention. Of course, they had some recommendation, but they felt that they changed their behavior. They felt they learned new skills. They felt empowered. They used that word. They felt that other family member changed, and the kids, of course, changed in their involvement in the families, especially dinner time. This is something a lot of them talked about. So this is an example of building capacity within families. So helping family learn new strategy, use them in the natural environment, and help support both them as caregivers and their children. The next study, and I'm looking at the time, I want to make sure I have time for everything. The next study is cascading model with 4 different tiers. In this way, we did the study with the caregiver implemented intervention. As I mentioned, we had like 12 family, and we saw similar results across all the families. But scaling it up is really difficult. And of course, us as researchers are not supposed to work directly with the kids. Professionals who provide services, who have families on the caseload, are the ones who's supposed to work directly with the kids. So we added another tier to the cascading model, in which we train and coach professionals who then work directly with the caregiver on their caseload, and then these caregivers work with their children. Again, it's the same flowchart that I showed you before with the different component of coaching. We start with discuss kind of the strategy. We identify target strategy and identify activity, review the strategy, especially the strategy I mentioned before. Then we just observe the interaction between the child or the parent in this case. Ask the caregiver to reflect, provide supportive feedback, corrective feedback, and thinking about problem solving, and then make sure the question. So next I'm going to show you a short video. In this video, it's about 2 minutes long. You'll see a provider. In this case, it will be a developmental therapist in early intervention, working from her own office. Communicating with the parents who's going to work with their own child, and we'll kind of edit that so you can see different pieces of the coaching, just so you'll see how it looks like. So this is about 2 minutes long.
In today's session, what's your target communication behavior?
So to get him to add a couple words to a request. So instead of just saying more or again, to have him increase the length of a request.
Okay. I'm just going to review the time delay worksheet again. So time delay, what we're going to do is just work on establishing the joint attention. I'm going to go ahead and put you on mute and have you guys go, and then we'll chat about it afterwards.
You have bubbles?
When you were doing it though, how do you feel like he was responding to you, or?
He was engaging really nicely. Like he was doing eye contact, he was making requests.
one of the things that I really loved that you did is at the beginning when he was saying, open the bubbles, or I want the bubbles open. I can't remember the exact phrase that he was doing. And you were wanting him to do something else. And so you were like, the bubbles are open. And then would wait for him. And after about 2 or 3 times, then he finally was like, I want you to blow the bubbles. Yeah. So it sounds awesome on that thing that I was wondering if that might help is like if you vary your praise at the end and said like, oh, I loved how you asked for me to blow the bubbles, or even something funny like, are you sure you want the bubbles? Because then we could practice that yes/no question too. You're waiting expectantly, is your face is, you're like, I'm so engaged with you, come back. And he had some nice spontaneous things happening this time. So I would say you're doing really great.
Okay, so this was just an example. And again, this was before the pandemic. So we used that, but we continue to use something very similar. And I'm sure many of the professionals who attend today use that during the pandemic too. So now I'm going to show you some data related to that. So in this case, we look at the functional relation between training and coaching of professional this time via telepractice to increase their use of coaching practices. So we're not focusing on the parents' behavior now. Now we're focusing on the professional behavior. We want to make sure that all the professionals have all the information about adult learning theory and about coaching. So we added some training for professionals about adult learning theory, about how to coach, and we're measuring in this case the fidelity of coaching practices. Not focusing on the strategy the parents using, even though we're collecting those data, but this is not what I'm going to present today. We also want to make sure if there's a relation between the training professional and the knowledge of coaching. And finally, of course, is the social validity for the professional caregivers. Again, do they find it feasible? Do they find it helpful? Do they find it appropriate? We're using, again, single case, and I'm going to kind of go through the graph again. So participant in this case, we have 4 units. Each unit has a researcher. Because remember, this is the cascading model with the 4 tiers. We have a researcher, we have an EI, early intervention provider, we have a caregiver and a child. This is demographic. You see some diversity. We have white, Asian professional, we have Latina and white and Asian caregivers. The kids, some of them have only gesture, eye contact, some of them have some words. And we have some diversity with the years of experience of the provider. So again, each unit will be represented, but we're going to focus really about the EI provider's behavior. So again, just orientation of the graph. On the left side, we have the line graph, which is the fidelity of coaching this time. Again, it's not fidelity of the evidence-based practice of social communication strategy, it's fidelity of coaching. And on the right side, we have knowledge. So we did quiz to see knowledge of a set of coaching practices. Each tier here represents 1 early intervention provider. So we're looking at the baseline and we see not a lot of high fidelity. They don't use a lot of the steps within best coaching practices. We do the training. We still don't see a lot of changes in behavior. So we don't see, even if they did the training about adult learning theory and practices, we don't see a lot of changes in the way they use these practices with families. And this is the bar graph that represent their knowledge. So even before the intervention, before they did the training on those, they had a lot of knowledge about coaching and how to coach. After they did the training, we see some increase. But what's interesting, we don't see a lot of changes in the way they practice. Again, going back to the importance of both training and coaching and adult learning theory. So when we start coaching, so this is kind of, we don't see a lot of increase in knowledge, but as soon as we start coaching, we see a jump in the fidelity of coaching. And the small errors are the coaching on different strategy, because again, we're using modeling, man model, and time delay. So we don't see changes based on the type of strategy focusing on, it's just the coaching. And again, this is another example of how coaching is so important. And when we give some coaching, then we see increase in the strategy. We have one early intervention provider that was more gradual, but overall we see there's functional relations. So this intervention was effective. We wanted to look also at other professionals. So in this case, we look at BCBA, Board Certified Behavior Analyst. Again, we have 3 units. Each unit have 3 tiers: researcher, BCBA, caregiver, and child. And again, the data are very similar. The only difference here, this was done just before the pandemic. So we collected data on, again, the left side, and just all I'm going to show today is the coaching, the fidelity of coaching. We see some variability with some of the BCBAs, but overall it's below 50 or 60%. And then we had COVID, and we all went home and we couldn't work in the home in this, because in this case the BCBA went into the home, so we did the intervention with them through telepractice, but they work directly with family in their natural environment. Then we had COVID, so we said, oh, what we're doing, are we going to stop? And then we decided just to collect more data with telepractice. So all the white circles are when the BCBA implemented interventions through telepractice, and we see that it's similar to what happened before when they did it in home. Still, the fidelity is low, and even though we did the training, we don't see a lot of change. And then the final one is when we do coaching, we see again an increase in the fidelity. Some BCBA, the first one, start going into the home again. There was some kind of changes in the regulations, so some, and then of course we have maintenance. So they continue to do it, even continue to use high fidelity of coaching even after we completed the training. So these data are similar to what we just saw with the early intervention. We see that coaching and training leads to improvement. And of course, we have data also on parents' behavior and children behavior. So overall, the result from these 2 studies, and these 2 studies focus on building capacity of families and professional. So professional practice, we see that they use high fidelity. They have very positive perception of social validity, and they said to us, they're going to use it with other people on their caseload. Professional ask us for, we have materials in Spanish and in English and in other languages right now. So we share those so they can use with other families. Caregivers, again, use the word empowerment. They use the quality, the high quality of the strategy that they were taught. They use them throughout the day, and again, felt like this was something they can use and appreciate. And child behavior, of course, child communication, we don't see a big jump in their behavior, change in social communication skills, but we do see some changes. The next study is the last one I'm going to present today. And this is 4 level, but different level than what I mentioned before. And as I mentioned, there's some communities or even countries that we don't have a lot of professionals. These are low resource communities or setting. And in this case, it's hard for us as a researcher to find enough professional to train caregiver, or not train and coach and help caregivers. So we're looking at caregivers who have a little bit more experience to coach other caregivers. So it's parents to parent support. In this case, we have a researcher who train and coach caregiver, who then train and coach a different caregiver who work directly with their child. This was a study done by one of my doctoral students, James Lee, who's graduated now and work as a postdoctoral, and he gave me permission to use his data. So in this case, we're looking at functional relation between training and coaching caregivers via telepractice to increase coaching, very similar to what we've done before. The data also look, the participant, we have again 4 tiers, but instead of professional here, we have caregivers. we have the research assistant, we have all of them again was mothers, we have different educational level. The unit 1 or the first caregiver had 2 families that they work with. I'm trying to go fast, so we'll have time for the question at the end. Results also similar to what we've seen before. So in this case, we have on the left side the quality of the fidelity of the coaching. We have 2 lined graphs here, each one for 1 family. We see in baseline, we see some variability, but overall the fidelity is low. Then we do the online training. Then we do coaching, and again, we see immediate increase for all caregivers. And then these are caregivers, these are other parents of kids with autism who had kids with autism who were a little bit older, who had more experience with working with other parents, and they volunteered to work with parents of new diagnosed families who wanted some more support. And we see increase in the coaching, in the coaching practices, and of course also in the maintenance. So overall, we see similar data, functional relation again between the training, coaching as a package of intervention and coaching. And looking at the result, and this is an example of building capacity of families and communities. So we started just within the families, then we moved to building capacity of families and professional. And this time we're looking at building capacity of families and communities, of kind of scaling out as scaling up the impact of the intervention. This one, they have high fidelity of coaching, positive perception. And again, the model of low parent-to-parent intervention is very needed and essential in areas or low resource community where we don't have a lot of professional. The last thing I want to mention is the community engagement. In this case, it's very important to engage with the community. So thinking about building partnership with families, we talked about building partnership with other professionals, but this is also engaging the community as a whole, which is another thing to consider. So overall, I'm kind of ending here. Building capacity. So we know training and coaching via telepractice are effective. We know that they are feasible. We know that parents can learn strategies and use them with high fidelity with their kids. We know that professionals can learn how to train and coach other adults like caregivers who then work directly with their kids. And we also know that other caregiver can work with a caregiver as parent-to-parent support. So we have the different cascading model of support. And this way we build capacity with family, with professional and communities. Another way to look to that, into kind of the ideas of how we build capacity, is to thinking about the scaling up. And if we have one researcher and few professional, and each professional work with a few caregiver on the caseload, and sometimes we have caregiver who work with other caregiver, we can think about the cascading again. So researcher work with professional work with caregivers, and caregivers work with children. We always need to remember that our goal is to improve, in this case, the social communication skills of young children with autism, and improve the quality of life of caregivers. So when one researcher can reach many, and professional, of course, can reach all the families on their caseload, then we really reach out many families and children as much as we can. So I know I was asked to leave a few minutes to the end. So I just want to acknowledge all the families and professionals who work with us, help us learn how to improve all this system and all the cascading model. And of course, everyone in my research team and all of you who stayed the whole day and listened. And I'm happy to answer any question people might have.
We do have a question. Someone had brought something up after the second study that you described, and they asked, was anything done to assess if fidelity continued without direct observation of the skill? If not, what methods would you recommend for future research to ensure skills are used outside of being observed by a professional?
So is this the study with the that we look at parents or we work with professional? Because in both cases, so when we work with professional, one of the things we talk about, and yes, this is a really good question because we never know what happened when we leave, right? In this case, we just turn off the computer and we don't know. In the other case, we do the intervention, then we stay in the home and talk with them. And that's actually the most important question, right? The maintenance. And when we work with families, we do and go and collect some generalization data. But again, there's some, because we're there on the screen or the home, it could impact. When we work with professional, what we do, we really give them a checklist to really kind of check themselves and see if they use everything. And we do communicate, and we have some professional who still contacting us with question about the model, question about how we're working. But these are very important questions. Did really things maintain? And to increase that is using it in the natural environment, helping people reflect on their own skills, and giving them some materials, checklists as reminders of what needs to be done and how to be done. But these are very good questions. Thank you.
Yes, they were referring to the parents, working with the parents. But yeah, it was very good question. It does not look like we have any other questions coming up at the moment. People might just be tired. It's been a long day. Understand.
Long day. Yeah, I know you've all been on next to the screen for a long time. So
yes. Well, we thank you so much for presenting for us today and sharing the research. It was great to see all the great work that you're doing. And I thank you everybody for joining us today. We're so happy to provide this opportunity. There will be a link in the chat to fill out our survey to get feedback. It'll also pop up when you close out your screen. And we might just send it to you again just for to get some of that information from you. If you have any questions, please reach out to us and have a great rest of your day. Thank you.